the Georgetown Law Federal Society. This series is dedicated to Daniel Webster, one of our nation's most revered orators and public servants. Webster relied on the strength of his ideas to advance the American people's liberty and prosperity. He is rightly remembered as the great expounder and defender of the Constitution. Our resolution tonight is, does free trade harm national security? Whether or not that's true, we're thrilled to have such esteemed speakers for this free exchange of ideas. To debate this topic, we have former acting United States Trade Representative Stephen Vaughn and Dr. Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Really two of the best. We are also thrilled to have the Honorable Chad A. Radler of the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. We want to thank them and all of you for joining us in this snowy weather. We're deeply grateful for the Federal Society and to Georgetown Law for making the Daniel Webster debate series a reality. I now recognize our excellent Director of Debates, Mr. Ian Stapleton, to introduce these three stellar panelists. Please give them a warm welcome.
The Honorable Chad A. Radler serves as a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Before taking his seat on the bench, Judge Radler served as Acting Assistant Attorney General for the Civil Division of the United States Department of Justice. Before that, he worked in the Columbus office of Jones Day in the firm's Issues and Appeals Practice Group. And while at Jones Day, his representative experience truly took him to places such as the United States Supreme Court, where he was representing an inmate claiming actual innocence, to Nairobi, Kenya, with Lawyers Without Borders to train local lawyers in prosecuting domestic violence cases. And those are just a few things. You can find more online of the amazing things he's done with Jones Day. Judge Radler earned his undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Michigan. There we go. And after graduating, he served as a law clerk to Judge Alan Norris of the Sixth Circuit. Stephen P. Vaughn is a partner in the international trade team of King and Spalding. Mr. Vaughn previously served for over 2 years as the general counsel for the Office of the United States Trade Representative, and during 2 months in early 2017, he served as the acting United States Trade Representative. While at USTR, Mr. Vaughn was directly involved in matters including the U.S.-Canada-Mexico Agreement and actions involved in matters and actions undertaken by the United States against China, just to name a few instances. He also supervised U.S. litigation efforts before the World Trade Organization. His legal experience has brought him before the U.S. International Trade Commission, the U.S. Court of International Trade, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Mr. Vaughn, most notably perhaps, has also served as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center. He has co-taught a seminar on U.S. trade policy and the WTO. He earned his BA from Vanderbilt University and his JD from Yale Law School. Last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Michael R. Strain, who is the Director of Economic Policy Studies and the Arthur F. Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Strain is concurrently Professor of Practice in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, and he holds a number of prestigious research positions elsewhere. He has served on several committees and working groups at the intersection of academic research and economic and social policy, including for the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Before joining AEI, Dr. Strain worked in the Center for Economic Studies at the United States Census Bureau and in the Macroeconomics Research Group at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He received his BA from Marquette University, an MA from NYU, another MA from Cornell University, and a PhD in economics from Cornell as well. So if we could have one more big round of applause for our panel as I hand it over to Judge Radler.
Well, thank you. It's great to see everyone. I'm Chad Radler, as mentioned, a judge on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Brady, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be back at Georgetown. So I'm here mostly like you to take in this really great, I think, discussion that's ahead. I have to say, as judges, we don't see a lot of trade issues. Those are mostly litigated in the Court of International Trade in New York. And so most judges on most courts of appeals aren't going to see these issues regularly. And national security issues are also issues that we sometimes see, but not that often. It can be very challenging for courts, you can imagine, because national security issues sometimes require you to consider matters that are hard hard for judges to decide, or maybe judges don't have expertise on, or are difficult issues because they're oftentimes things that are decided by Congress and the president, and harder for courts to employ. So in that way, I'm like you, really excited to be here with our panelists. So I think we're going to start with maybe 7 minutes or so from each panelist. We'll let them respond to the things they hear. I'll then maybe have a couple of questions, but hopefully all of you will have some questions as well. So I think Steve's going to start. I would like to say we had like a coin flip backstage or arm wrestling or something, but I think it's just luck of the draw, good or bad. But does free trade harm national security?
Well, like a lot of good lawyers, I think the answer is that it depends. And in order to explain that, I just want to start by saying I'm really glad to be doing this now as opposed to 8 years ago when I went into the USTR. Because 8 years ago, this whole debate would have been overshadowed by three ghosts, which hopefully we won't have to spend a lot of time on. The first ghost are the people who are obsessed with the morality of trade. And these are people who would look out the window and see troops from a foreign land marching in triumph down Pennsylvania Avenue and say to themselves, well, at least we didn't interfere with any sales between a willing seller and a willing buyer. Okay. If that is your view, I'm not going to be able to help you. This is not a religious studies argument. This is going to be more of a practical argument. The second ghost are our old friends, Mr. Smoot and Mr. Hawley, who did some things a long time ago, and I don't feel obliged to defend what they did. I think, and I'm happy to talk about the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 and why it was more a policy that was designed for the 1890s as opposed to a policy that was designed for the 1930s. But as you all know, senators sometimes reflect on the debates of their youth and bring some ideas into the current day. I am not defending the proposition that all trade regulations are good or that all trade regulations are correct or that you can never interfere with markets in a way that would ultimately harm the country or harm our national security. So I'm not here to defend Mr. Spoot or Mr. Hawley. And then third would be obviously the ghost of Bill Clinton. You know, he's still with us, of course. But the ghost I'm referring to is the Bill Clinton who came to America in 2000 and said that he had done a deal to let China into the WTO and that it was just one of the most one-sided deals in history. And he was right, but not in the way that he had intended. I think that we are much more practical than we were 8 years ago. I think people now recognize that our relations with China have not played out in the way that a lot of people thought 25 years ago. But at the same time, I'm not going to blame anybody for that at this time. The truth is, we don't have time or energy or resources to waste on these abstract concepts. You live in a very dangerous world. You are going to live in a world that is more dangerous than the world in which I lived and I practiced. When I was your age, the Cold War came to an end. The Berlin Wall fell. We really were ecstatic about it. And unfortunately for you, we have largely squandered that safety. You are going to live in a more dangerous world. You are going to face more dangerous enemies than anything that the Americans have faced in my lifetime. The threat that we face from the Chinese Communist Party is worse than the threat that we faced from the Soviet Union. Soviets never had an industrial base that compared to ours. China's industrial base is much bigger than ours. Soviet Union never challenged us in the markets. The Chinese are the largest exporter in the world and by far most countries' favorite trading partner. The United States never had a technological disadvantage when it faced Soviet Union. China has technological superiority to us in many industries and is trying to get technological superiority to all of them. They have the ability to have a bigger army, bigger navy, bigger air force. Measured on a parity basis, their economy is bigger than ours. Measured on any basis, their industrial base is bigger than ours. You are the first Americans since the Civil War to live in a world where you have a geopolitical adversary who has a bigger industrial base than you do. you will have to proceed with great caution through the next 20 years. And therefore, what you're going to hear from me tonight is not that there is a simple answer, that you could solve this problem by lifting all restrictions on free trade, or that it's a simple problem that you can solve it by imposing tariffs. What I'm going to tell you tonight is this: you will want your flexibility. You may need tariffs. You may need subsidies. You may need regulations. You're going to need every trick in the policy playbook to get through the next 25 years with your freedom and your independence and your security intact. And so that's what I mean when I say it depends, because we didn't do free trade with the Nazis and we didn't do free trade with the Soviet Union. And there are really good reasons for that. And so we have to be very careful and we have to be cautious and we have to get it right. I will absolutely agree with Dr. Strain that if we wreck the economy on foolish trade policies, that will hurt the national security. It's going to be up to you to make sure that we have the right policies.
Good thing. All right, Michael, throw it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here and braving the elements. I am taking the other side of this question. I don't believe that free trade harms national security, although it's hard to argue with the it depends stance. But if that's I'm perhaps a bad lawyer because I didn't think of it depends as a possible option. I was told yes or no were the options, and I just saluted and barged forward. So I'll be defending no. I was prepared to make 4 quick points to support the view that free trade does not harm national security. I'm tempted to make a 5th point, which is to defend the religion of individual liberty and the benefits of free exchange, but maybe we can get into that a little bit later in the debate. So let me just stick with these points. Stephen talked a lot about the importance of a manufacturing base, and I think we can debate that. If we have strong relationships with our allies, then in the event of some sort of massive war with China, what really matters is the manufacturing industrial base of the US-led anti-China coalition. Apart from that, though, the alternative to free trade, which is protectionism, actually weakens US manufacturing capacity. It does not strengthen it. And this is one of the most central errors that the Trump administration made, thinking that if you put a bunch of tariffs on imported goods, that will help domestic manufacturers of goods. That might sound counterintuitive, and I think the logic of tariffs is quite intuitive. If you're a household, if you're a business, and you want to buy something, and the thing you're buying comes from abroad, putting a tariff on that import makes buying it from a foreign manufacturer relatively more expensive. That should mean that you're more inclined to buy it from a domestic manufacturer, to buy it from somebody who made it here in America. The person who made it here in America doesn't have to pay the tariff, and so they can be more competitive. That is, true in the abstract. You might argue it's true in the realm of religion. It might be what an economics 101 textbook tells you. But the reality of today's integrated supply chains means that it's not true. And the reason it's not true is because US manufacturers import a whole lot of what they need in order to make stuff here at home. If we put a tariff on steel, as the Trump administration did, that will help steel manufacturers. But there are several dozen jobs in America that depend on steel for every one steel manufacturing job in America. And so you end up putting at a competitive disadvantage all the businesses that rely on imported goods that are subject to the tariff. There are some industries where the damage you're doing to the US economy is even stronger. If we put a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada, as President Trump indicated that he would do, and then backed out at the 11th hour from doing, that would hit automobiles. An automobile will cross the US border half a dozen times, a dozen times in the process of being manufactured. The way the Trump administration wrote the executive order, every time it crossed that border, it would be hit with a tariff. You know, this degrades and erodes the US manufacturing base. It doesn't support it. And so you can argue about whether, out of concern for some potential future war with China, we need to be able to make a whole bunch of stuff here in America. But if your view is that we should be able to make a whole bunch of stuff here in America, then you should be opposed to the protectionist measures of the Trump and Biden administration. Point number 2, free trade supports security alliances. And those security alliances are extremely important if you're concerned about some sort of conflict with China. It is hard to get an intuition about how integrated the global economy has become. Trade between the United States and the European Union represents around 1/3 of global economic output. That's really a lot. The US or the EU is the largest trade and investment partner in nearly every other country in the world. Bilateral trade and investment between the US directly supports over 9 million jobs in America, indirectly supports over 16 million jobs in America. Put those numbers in context. The number of jobs supported by economic integration between the US and the EU is larger than the number of people who live in Switzerland. It is larger than the number of people who live in Virginia. Rolling back free trade with our European allies is damaging to the US economy. It's damaging to the European economy. It weakens the security alliance between the US and Europe that will be, again, extraordinarily important should this war with China come. We should be doing everything. If we're really worried about a war with China, we should be doing everything we can to strengthen that security alliance, and that includes recognizing the harm that would come from rolling back free trade with the EU, and it includes strengthening our diplomatic, our material, our security, and our economic relationship with the EU. Point number 3, I guess I did anticipate, and it depends. Like unfettered free trade obviously may not be in the best interests of the nation. An example that I use, imagine that every day everybody had to wake up first thing in the morning and swallow a pill, or you would have some sort of horrible thing happen to you. Would you want that pill manufactured in Beijing? Probably not. Would you want that pill manufactured in Taiwan? Probably not. If that pill were being manufactured in Taiwan, would we want to do something about that? We probably would. And so I do think it is important not to stop the argument with an appeal to the importance of economic liberty, and an appeal to the importance of not turning the United States into some sort of economic police state. Again, it's important to remember, we talk about trade as if nations are trading with each other, but nations are not trading with each other. People and businesses in nations are trading with each other. We should have a pretty good reason, in my judgment, to have the government say, you want to engage in that trade, but you're not allowed to do that. But that disposition or inclination can't be taken to the maximal position of no restrictions ever under any circumstances on trade. And my final point is that I think it's important not to have this conversation in the abstract. It's important, I think we kind of had to have this conversation in the abstract in 2017 and 2018 when President Trump first took office and when President Trump first launched his trade war. And the reason for that is because you really kind of had to go back to Mr. Smoot and Mr. Hawley for the last time the United States engaged in protectionism of the scale that President Trump did. Well, now we don't have to do that. We now have had a protectionist Republican term. We have had a protectionist Democrat term. We can look to what happened during the first Trump term. We can look to what happened during the Biden term. And the debate about free trade should be anchored in those experiences and should be anchored in a discussion of what President Trump is interested in doing. What does that specifically mean? It means that, we have evidence that President Trump's first trade war eroded our manufacturing capacity. We have evidence that President Trump's first trade war weakened our alliances with other nations. President Biden wanted to subsidize the production of things here at home rather than apply tariffs to the importation to importing things made abroad. President Macron of France said that President Biden's plans threaten to, quote, fragment the West. This is serious stuff. And President Biden's efforts were harmful to those security alliances. A lot of the discussion, and I think we've heard this already tonight, a lot of the discussion about is free trade good or bad, especially when it occurs in the abstract, tends to focus on China. I'm not sure why a looming war with China means that we should put 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. I'm not sure why a looming war with China means that we should put massive tariffs on Europe. I'm not sure why a potential war with China means that we should be putting tariffs on imported Chinese t-shirts or imported Chinese children's toys. So let's anchor the discussion a little bit in some of these specifics. I feel like I've talked for substantially longer than 7 minutes. Okay, 2 thumbs up.
That was great. In court, we have a red light. Don't have that. Don't have that here. So to paraphrase Justice Kagan, it sounds like we're all protectionists now. If you look at the last 2 administrations.
I'll
But
take that.
I want some response.
But
Sure.
yes, yeah. So let me just a couple of things. First of all, I'm really happy that we're going to be practical and we're not going to talk about the maximalist debate. I'm glad we've moved past all that and we can start talking about practical. You guys are going to have to live in a very practical world, and it's better that we have very practical conversations. The Americans did foreign policy for about 200 years before they got to the 1990s, and for every one of those 200 years, they thought about trade policy, and they recognized that they lived in a very tricky world and that they had trade restrictions for the same reason they had taxes. Nobody likes taxes, nobody likes trade restrictions, but sometimes you need them. And the important thing is to make sure that you get them right so that they're accomplishing the national goals as opposed to getting them wrong so that they're harmful. So I think I'm really glad that we're going to have this kind of a practical conversation. Couple of other things. One, let me just give you a couple of facts here. In 1999, the U.S. real median household income in 2023 dollars was $70,210. That was way up from where it had been in the early 90s. The next year, they let China into the WTO. 16 years later, when Mr. Trump came down the escalator, the real median household income in the United States was around $71,000. So that's 16 years with no growth for the average person. 4 years later, in 2019, after all the things that Mr. Trump did, real median household income in the United States was $81,210. So if you guys want to know, why do these people in Michigan vote for him? Why do these people in Wisconsin vote for him? Why do these people in Pennsylvania vote for him? Because they saw their wages going up. And one of the reasons they saw their wages going up is that businesses had less leverage to shift jobs offshore and to hurt workers. They stagnated again under Mr. Biden. So I think the final point I would sort of make in this short exercise is I think we do have to really focus on the China situation. For example, China toys. What's going to happen with the money China gets from those toys? What's going to happen with the partnerships China builds in the United States? What's going to happen with the intellectual property that China may pick up as part of its partnerships? Maybe it's fine. Maybe it doesn't make a difference if they have a $270 billion surplus with the United States, which means that we're basically selling them $270 billion worth of assets every year. On the other hand, maybe they're taking that money and doing things with it that we would rather not have them do. Maybe they're using it to get leverage over countries in Southeast Asia. Maybe they're using it to build up their military. We never did this with the Soviet Union. We never did it with Nazi Germany. It is very, very risky to help your geopolitical adversary become the richest and most powerful country in the world. And I personally think you guys are going to spend a lot of the next 25 years asking yourselves, who thought that was a good idea? So, but happy to get into the specifics as we go on.
Rebuttal response or?
Yeah, I can maybe briefly to atone for my extended opening remarks. Look, I mean, median household income took a big hit during the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent Great Recession, which was the worst economic calamity since the Great Depression. That many scholars argue the Smoot-Hawley tariffs contributed to. I don't think we can look at median income statistics and conclude anything dispositive about the effect of trade with China. The debate about that is often couched in terms of jobs lost, and it's pretty common to hear about how trade with China caused devastation in manufacturing communities. So the best academic estimates suggest, the high end estimates suggest that the U.S. maybe lost 2 million jobs between 1999 and 2011 as a consequence of trade with China. In a typical month, 5 million workers separate from their employers. So 2 million jobs over a decade due to trade with China compared to 5 million jobs a month for all reasons, including trade. This is not to minimize the degree to which disruption can be disruptive, but it is important, I think, to put the effects of China entering the WTO into context. The United States has really, since the 1950s, seen manufacturing employment decline long before we started trading with China. The reason manufacturing employment is declining is because manufacturing is becoming a more productive industry. If you really want to bring manufacturing back, then your target should be technology. Your target should not be trade, and your target certainly should not be trade with one nation. In terms of financing China's growth, I think I'm not really even sure how to think about that. I guess it's true in the strictest sense that the U.S. didn't buy a lot of products from Nazi Germany. I also think that the analogy between Nazi Germany and China falls apart pretty quickly when it's probed. So we should be careful. I think we should be identifying specific goods that we don't want to buy from China. We should be identifying specific goods and specific technologies that we don't want U.S. firms to be selling to China. I don't think children's toys and T-shirts would be on anybody's list. And it seems to me that the objective of trade policy under both the Trump and Biden administrations, includes some national security concerns, but attempting to justify everything that the Trump and Biden administrations have done on the basis of national security, I think fails in a pretty obvious way.
Can I just make
Yeah,
one, I just want
absolutely.
to make one quick factual point. So he said that manufacturing been going down since the fifties. I think what he means is manufacturing as a percentage of total jobs, as a percentage of the total economy. Actually, if you look at the number of jobs, we had about 18 million manufacturing jobs in January 1967. And then 33 years later, in December of 2000, we had 17.2 million manufacturing jobs. So the amount of total jobs, total manufacturing jobs in the US actually stayed fairly stable for most of my when I was growing up. And then we let China into the WTO, and by 2009, we were down to 11.5 million manufacturing. So it's not just a percentage of it's the actual collapse in total jobs lost.
There are probably more people employed as farmers today than were employed as farmers in the year 1810 in the United States. Nobody would argue that it's boom times for agricultural employment.
Right. But what I am saying is there's a difference between manufacturing going down as a percentage of all jobs and manufacturing falling off a cliff in absolute terms.
I have a couple questions maybe I can throw out. So I'll start with Steven. It's
You should have seen these debates when they were carried on at the abstract level.
So our topic was, does free trade harm national security? I take it, Steve, your point is that protectionism is necessary to preserve our national security. Is that right?
I think at least some of what Dr. Strain would refer to as protectionism is necessary to preserve national security. Yes.
Okay.
I think there are going to be times where we're going to have to do something. And at least some people would say that's protectionist. And my point is, well, whatever you call it, it's something that we're going to have to do. For example, I think it is pretty obvious at this point that if you guys want to be able to make cars in the United States, if you think it would be good to be able to make drones in the United States, if you think it would be good to be able to make steel in the United States, if you think any of that is going to be helpful for your national security, you're going to have to engage in something that some people would refer to as protection.
Now, maybe a Mike's rebuttal point might be if we sort of a lot of your comments seem to be focused on China, and if you look more broadly, a lot of this protectionist activity actually disrupts important relationships we have with Europe and other places, and those relations are important to our national security. So, are there broader concerns? Maybe we sort of help ourselves with vis-a-vis China, but we're hurting ourselves in other parts of the world.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two parts to that. First of all, remember that China is also attacking all these other markets in the world, right? It's becoming increasingly, the United States is more and more, for a lot of industries, the US is almost sort of the last market where there's actual market competition, where you're not being wiped out by China. So that means everybody is going to come in here and try to sell here. So you guys are going to have to make some tough choices, right? If you want to have a car industry, you probably are going to have to put restrictions on cars from countries other than China, because there is enough car making capacity outside the United States that they can pretty much replace you. Same thing with steel. Right now in the world, there's over 500 million tons of steel making capacity that is not being used. Okay. We use about 130 million tons of steel a year. So if you want to have steel here, you have to make sure that that other capacity isn't used to flood this market. And there's going to be a lot of examples like that. And the third thing you guys are going to have to do is you're going to have to get, as I said from the beginning, you guys are going to have to be really, really practical. Okay. So if your plan is that someday you're going to have, say, 100,000 troops in the Philippines, 250,000 troops. At one point, when I was a kid, when I was a child, we had 500,000 troops in South Vietnam, right? So if you end up in a situation where you have a very large army in the Philippines, how practical is it to supply that army by having ships go from Japan and Korea over to the United States and then back across the ocean? Is that going to work? Is that something you can count on? So obviously you guys have to have a robust foreign policy. You have to figure out which of the countries you can work with and which of the countries you can't work with. But remember, at every step along the way, you are going to have an adversary who has virtually unlimited funds and virtually unlimited resources who will also be trying to appeal to those same people. Can you really win a bidding war with all these other countries? Yes, in the Cold War, we could sort of do that with a lot of countries. You're not going to be able to win a bidding war against China.
Thoughts, response, or
I mean, again, I think we should root this in some of the practical realities. So if you want to have a steel making industry in the United States, then you're going to have to do protectionist stuff. Let's maybe focus on that one. Do we need a steel making industry in the United States if we have good relationships with other countries that make steel? This is, I think, a very debatable proposition. Let's say we decide the answer is yes. Something that happened quite recently is that a company located in Japan wanted to invest in US steel. And this was greeted with enthusiasm by investors in US steel, and it was greeted enthusiastically by US steel employees. And the reason is because this Japanese company, Nippon Steel, wanted to inject a whole bunch of money and technical expertise into US Steel that would make US Steel more competitive. Japan is one of our strongest security allies on Earth. This negotiation over Nippon's acquisition of US Steel took place at the same time that the Biden administration was attempting to increase our security relationship with Japan. And the Biden administration decided that it would not allow this investment into US Steel from one of our most important security allies. President Trump was opposed to this as well and indicated that he would kill the deal if it survived into his time in office. This, it was a chink in our relationship with Japan. This is something that was the subject of much discussion when the Japanese Prime Minister came to the United States in the final year of the Biden administration. Everybody lost. That security relationship was weaker. Japan's economy lost. Our economy lost. The U.S. steel industry lost. U.S. steel employees lost.
Okay, so full disclosure, as in my practice, I have represented steel companies, and I represent steel companies now. So let me just again, and this goes back to what I think you guys need to start getting used to. There are a lot of hard trade-offs here. So a few facts that you should know as you guys decide whether or not you want to approve this deal. Nippon Steel has a long history of unfair trade in the United States. They have been found to engage in unfair trade on dozens of occasions by the U.S. Department of Commerce. They are currently under order and facing tariffs on 12 different product lines because they not only engaged in unfair trade, they actually harmed U.S. companies. One of the reasons that U.S. steel is not as valuable as it could be is because for 30 years, they faced unfair trade from a lot of countries, including Japan. So you need to know that fact. Second fact you need to know is the steel workers, the union, for the most part, some of the local people in the union supported the deal, but the leadership of the union was vehemently opposed to the deal on the grounds that there will come a time when the ownership of the company will have to decide whether they want to shutter production in Japan or shutter production in the United States. Because remember, we have too much steelmaking capacity in the world already. And so remember, if you get this wrong, and it turns out that they decide to shutter the production capacity in the United States because they prioritize the production in Japan, then you have lost U.S. steel forever. So these are very difficult questions. Should people be rewarded for decades of unfair trade? Should you be willing to risk a critical U.S. industry on the grounds that you trust the management of Nippon Steel? None of these questions that get to your desk are going to be easy, okay? All through the Cold War, the U.S. and its allies had one trade dispute after another. Nixon put tariffs on everybody in 1971 because he thought our trade deficit was too big. We had, if any of you go back to the 80s, you will find all kind of fear mongering about the trade deficit. And that didn't involve China. That involved the EU and Japan. So the policymakers of that generation, would it have been easier if they could have just ignored all these trade disputes and kept everybody focused on the Soviet Union? Yes, it would have been. But they could not. They had to keep their own voters on side. They had to avoid, the rise of a populist movement in the United States. And they had to hold the trading system together. And they could not hold the trading system together if most American voters thought it was a ripoff. So they managed through that. Y'all are going to have to manage through it.
Can I ask one legal question? So Congress could be imposing these tariffs, but that's not really how the government works these days. Congress is a bit dysfunctional, and so presidents of all stripes are making most policy in America. And so as I understand it, most of these tariffs are coming directly through presidential action. I think acting under the statute, the acronym is AIPA, but I'll admit I forget what each letter stands for. I should know a little better. When I was at the Department of Justice in 2017 and 2018, running the civil division there, we defended some of the steel tariffs and other tariffs put in place by the Trump administration. And won, I think, most of those cases in the Court of International Trade. But I'll just ask each of our panelists, is the president properly authorizing his power under that statute, the power that Congress has given him? And do we think there should be any reforms to that process?
So I want to say I was GC of USTR. I worked closely with the Civil Division. You guys did an amazing job.
Well, flattery will get you everywhere.
So let me just say very quickly. First of all, I actually think people misunderstand the Congress. I think it is functional. I think the truth of the matter is one of the things that it happens about being in the executive branch is that you really realize why you're in Article 2 and they're in Article 1, right? You go to meet with them, they don't come to meet with you. They get to take off on the weekends, you work on the weekends. They get to go on recess, the executive branch never goes on recess. I mean, the Congress has largely decided that it will use its almost unlimited powers under the Constitution to act as a sort of board of directors, right? They will watch and see what the president does. If the president gets into a dispute with the courts, they will watch that. If they don't like how things are going, they will weigh in. If they don't care how things are going, there's really no reason for them to get involved. So I think that's just where they are. And I think that's where they've been at many times in our history, to be honest. I think it's very difficult to force the Congress to take a stand on something that it doesn't want to take a stand on. They've decided to kind of wait and see how this plays out. In terms of the legal authorities, yeah, the president is using he has said he will use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. He's also talked about using Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which relates to national security. He's also talked about using Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which relates to situations where other countries are engaged in unfair trading practices. Each one of these provisions and several other provisions that he relies on has very specific requirements that you have to meet and that can and will be challenged in court. In his first term, he was sued over the tariffs with China, and the Court of International Trade upheld those tariffs. He was sued over the steel and aluminum tariffs, and the court upheld those tariffs. So he was successful at avoiding the various APA challenges that you guys are all reading about today. I suspect we will see a lot of challenges before this is all over. IEPA has not yet gone into the courts, at least on this issue. And we'll have to wait and see. Certainly, if I were them, I would be taking litigation risk very much into account.
Any thoughts?
I am at a distinct disadvantage on this panel in discussing what is legal and not legal.
Or just broader conceptual separation of powers or
my
budget. It's okay. It's okay.
That's what I was planning on doing. My sense is that there's pretty widespread agreement that the president is within his legal authority to do what he's been doing. There has been talk around town of challenging unilateral tariffs and trying to argue that if the tariff is unilateral, if it applies to every import, then it kind of like by definition can't be done for security reasons. That sounds compelling to me, but I am not a lawyer and don't know anything about that beyond like what sounds pleasing to my ears. In terms of what's happening with Congress, I mean, I agree with Mr. Vaughn's description of how Congress is behaving. I find that deeply troubling, and think that Congress should be reasserting its constitutional role. I think to at least some degree it has walked back from its constitutional role. And there I don't mean constitutional in a legal sense. I mean constitutional in a more broadly, civic sense. How is government supposed to work? Congress was not supposed to be a board of directors, I think it's to the nation's detriment that it's behaving that way, and not just vis-a-vis President Trump. I mean, Congress sat back and let the Biden administration do a lot of stuff that probably that in my view, again, not legally but just civically overstepped the president's role.
I hope there's some questions from the audience.
Can I just make one? Yeah,
Of course,
just two practical pieces of advice for all of you. Many of you probably will end up in the White House at some point, working on all these and other similar type issues. You will find that presidents are rarely interested in, and again, I actually agree with everything he just said about the Congress. But what y'all will learn is presidents are very rarely interested in hearing the advice of, we should take this to the Congress. That's not advice that presidents are usually all that interested in. And to be honest, it's not advice that the Congress is all that interested in.
Okay, fair point. All right here.
So given Say's law effect in capital markets and the need for efficient defense production, why would you not want free trade for defense production in industries like steel, where you need to get steel efficiently, you need to get it cheaply and effectively, and sometimes US production won't do that. So how is this any different from like the Corn Laws of England?
I love that question.
Yeah, because if you'll recall, they got rid of the Corn Laws of England, right? And then they spent a lot of the first half of the 20th century trying to figure out how they could get grain to England in the middle of war. Okay. The truth is, when you set yourself up, I mean, just believe me, if you go south of here down to Richmond, you can find a lot of statues of a lot of people in the 1860s who really, really believed in free trade and who really thought that their alliances with the British and the French were going to help them when they tried to fight all these mechanics from Pennsylvania and Ohio. And they were disappointed. Okay. When war comes, there are the people that you could count on, and there are the people that you cannot count on. There are a few things more poignant in the history of the world than people sitting around diplomats and begging people to ship them supplies in the middle of war. So obviously you have to balance these things. Of course, you can wreck your economy through foolish policies, right? You could wreck your economy through stupid taxes, right? But you need some taxes. So what you have to do, this is what I think this is the one thing where we totally agree. You cannot solve this problem at an abstract level. You have to really drill down, because remember, every time you guys are in there, you're going to hear really good arguments from both sides. Okay. Somebody's going to come in and tell you, if you do this, you're not going to have a steel industry. And then the other person's going to come in and tell you, actually, if you do this, you're going to have more steel. Right. And you're going to have to get it right. Okay. One of the most dangerous attitudes you can have in Washington is to say, these are my principles, and right or wrong, this is what I'm sticking with. No, you need to get it right. Okay. If you make a mistake, if you think this trade deal is going to lead to this outcome and it leads to this totally different outcome that you didn't expect, millions of people get hurt. Okay. So I don't think these are things that can be decided in the abstract. I think you really have to spend a lot of time, and I think you have to all be preparing yourselves mentally for the idea you're going to face a lot of tough choices. And you're gonna get some things wrong. We got tons of things wrong in the Cold War. Okay, but we kept changing strategies, we kept firing people, and we kept getting new people, and eventually we figured it out. But you will make mistakes. We've made huge mistakes, but now we need to start getting it right.
So how does that not lead to a sort of every country for itself in terms of production then?
Well, I think we're headed into a world in which more countries are going to be concerned about that. In other words, I mean, listen, one of the reasons that we have 500 and something million tons of excess steelmaking capacity is because almost every country in the world wants to have a steel industry. Why does Canada have a steel industry? Why does Australia have a steel industry? Why does South Africa have a steel industry? Why does India have a ministry of steel that now has 300 million tons of steelmaking capacity? These are just the nature of governments and of politics.
Any response or?
Yeah, I mean, look, my reaction to that is, well, at least one of my reactions to that is similar to my reaction to Mr. Vaughn's response about the Nippon Steel acquisition of U.S. Steel. Like, you know, I agree that there are choices to be made here. You know, Canada is one of our strongest allies on the planet. My recollection is that Canada sent soldiers to Vietnam because we asked. That's how strong our alliance is. You know, I think Canada is deeply offended by the United States launching a ridiculous tariff regime against them, and that weakens that security relationship. It weakens the relationship in general. That's to say nothing of the president openly and repeatedly referring to the head of that government as a governor, and openly and repeatedly expressing his desire to acquire that nation and extend our sovereignty over it. You know, Nippon, I mean, like, it's possible that, you know, a decade from now, Japan and America will be adversaries. I'm not particularly concerned about that. I would rather have the benefits of a stronger U.S. Steel, stronger U.S. manufacturing, higher wages for U.S. manufacturing workers today, and, you know, roll the dice on whether, like, Nippon reneges on the deal, roll the dice on whether Japan becomes our enemy in the future. It's, you know, not it's not, you know, completely crazy to be concerned about, you know, a world where the only nation the United States can depend on is the United States. But that just doesn't seem to me to be a likely enough event to handicap our economy and to reduce the wages of American workers.
Yeah, there's a question here.
I had a question for both panelists.
All right, I'll do
actually,
you
both.
next.
Okay,
No, good. You're good.
That was
You're
very
right next to
nice,
each other.
sorry.
Yeah.
But for both Mr. Vaughn and Dr. Strain, to what extent do you feel that the American public's perception of China's strength is actually reflected in the reality of China's capabilities? Because on one level, it feels like we hear a lot in our popular discourse about how strong China is. But then my understanding, at least, is that a lot of economists have done some sort of deeper work with the data and concluded that they also have some very serious vulnerabilities when you look at, you know, the debt within their real estate market or the risks from their population pyramid essentially imploding. To what extent do you think we might be overestimating China in the way that we may have overestimated the Soviet Union with things such as the missile gap in the 60s that never actually really existed, as it turned out?
So substantially. You know, Mr. Vaughn mentioned that the kind of current concerns about trade with China are not new in U.S. history, and they're not. I think the most recent analog are concerns about the United States being overtaken by Japan in the 1980s, and that was an incredibly formative period for President Trump's views on trade. And, you know, Japan didn't overtake the United States. China's economy is substantially weaker than President Trump suggests. Substantially weaker, I think, than the American people believe. There are enormous structural challenges that China faces. You mentioned problems in the real estate market. They also have incredible problems with their demographics. As a consequence of the one-child policy, they're going to have an extremely old society, a society where there are a lot of people who are too old to work and not a lot of people who are of working age. They have big problems with macroeconomic imbalances toward investment and away from consumption, and they're not really solving those problems. Having said that, they are a military power, and if they wanted to blockade Taiwan, they can do that at the same time they have a real estate problem. The China experts I speak to seem to agree that as China's domestic economic problems grow, their outward aggressiveness will recede. I don't know. I mean, I'm worried about it, and I think it's important to have an accurate understanding of their economic problems, but nothing that I have seen about their economic problems makes me less concerned about some of their aggressive impulses, particularly vis-a-vis Taiwan.
Couple of things. First of all, Canada did not fight in the Vietnam War. In fact, you could.
I retract.
Yeah, you could flee to Canada and escape if you didn't want to fight. CSIS, which is a big think tank here in town, this is from January 2023. CSIS developed a war game for a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan and ran it 24 times. In most scenarios, the US/Taiwan/Japan defeated a conventional amphibious invasion by China. However, the US and its allies lost dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of service members. Taiwan saw its economy devastated. Further, the high losses damaged the US global position for many years. So now I think people are really underestimating the risk of China.
Not sure what conclusion to draw from it, but I will note our catering tonight was from P.F. Chang's, which seems apropos to the topic. So last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, so my question was just, I think most of our discussion today has been about unilateral US action. And I was just curious, I guess the question would be mostly for Mr. Vaughn, what role do you think the WTO plays in all this, if any? I think we're at least formally still a member of the WTO. And some of the actions that President Trump has talked about, like a reciprocal tariff regime, I think would most likely violate our WTO commitments. So just, I don't know, I'm curious what you think we should think about that.
Yeah, I think the best thing for you guys to do, honestly, very seriously and candidly, I would think about the WTO exactly the same way you think about the UN. It's nice, we should be there, you should listen to everybody, they're gonna denounce us all the time, they're gonna vote against us all the time, they're gonna rule against us every chance we get, but don't ever expect them to help you.
Okay, anything in conclusion? Any last points to add?
Listen, I want to end on kind of a this is hard, okay? Geopolitics is hard. It was hard at Valley Forge. It was hard when Lincoln was trying to figure out how to stop the British and the French from supporting the South. It was hard, when Dean Acheson and these guys were trying to figure out how to build the Western Alliance after World War II. It's really hard, okay? And if you get it wrong, your country suffers devastating consequences. Britain used to have a mighty empire. They don't have one anymore. We used to be an unchallenged superpower. That's not true anymore. So you need to prepare to get it right. Okay? Thinking about that it's all going to work out, it's all going to be fine, it's all, we can trust this rule or we can trust that rule. That is just a mistake. But no one has gotten it right for a longer period of time under more different circumstances than the Americans. Okay? They have been extraordinarily good at geopolitics. It's easy to sit here and make fun of the Congress, and it's easy to sit here and make fun of ourselves. But the truth of the matter is, no one, not a single country on earth, navigated the 19th century better than we did. No one navigated the 20th century better than we did. You have an extraordinarily strong base. You have 350 million people who work really, really hard all the time and who are, for the most part, incredibly loyal to a government in DC that often mocks them and looks down on them. Okay? They are a great resource. No other country has this. The EU doesn't have it. China doesn't have it. No one else has it. Be proud of that. Be proud of this legacy and take up it is your turn now. Y'all are the ones who get to decide how much longer this goes on. And I absolutely think you can succeed. I think no country is better positioned to succeed than the United States. But we have to put in the work and take the time and get it right.
I guess 2 points. Geopolitics is certainly hard. We have a land war in Europe at the moment. We have a land war in the Middle East. We have heightened tensions in the Pacific. But geopolitics is not this hard. We should be embracing our allies. We should be drawing Europe closer to us. We should be drawing the UK closer to us. We should be drawing Canada and Mexico closer to us. We should be concerned about China. We should be strengthening our alliances with Pacific nations, including our economic alliances with Pacific nations, as a way to pressure China to behave better and to check their impulses. Mrs. Clinton couldn't support TPP, even though she helped design it, which would have done exactly that. President Trump didn't want to support TPP, even though it would have done exactly that. President Biden didn't want to do much there because of this protectionism, which I think has its roots much more in domestic political considerations than it has in the security of the United States or in our economic prosperity. So yes, Russia is an extremely hard problem. China is an extremely hard problem. What to do with the emergence of new powers like India is an extremely challenging problem. But the solution can't be to alienate our closest allies on Earth, to alienate some of the most important economies on Earth, to alienate some of our closest friends. Point number 2. I completely agree with Mr. Vaughn's patriotic assertions. I think they're empirically supported. The United States is exceptional with respect to our productive capacity, with respect to our ingenuity, with respect to our values. I think that's worth dwelling on. A lot of the debate about China presupposes that the United States should somehow be more like China. You know, we're falling behind China. China has all this protectionism. China has all these industrial policies. Where's our protectionism? Where are our industrial policies? I don't feel like that's the right starting point. I'm not sure why we should wish to be more like China. I'm not sure why we should wish to be envious of China. We should ask ourselves, you know, why is it that we have such a hardworking labor force? Why is it that that when a new technology is invented, it's probably invented here? Why is it that all the big tech firms are in California and nowhere else in the world? And how can we harness those strengths, and how can we run toward ourselves? We shouldn't rely on abstractions to guide our actions. But I think if you look at the practicalities, most of the time they support a very common sense and commonplace understanding of what it is that makes America exceptional.
All right. Well, I think at least 2 points of agreement. 1, America is the greatest nation on earth, and 2, we have a lot of issues that we face. That comes with responsibility, I suppose. Please join me in thanking our really terrific panelists.